Xerox invented the computer interface you are using right now. Then they let Apple walk off with it, essentially for free. Not inspired Apple, not contributed some ideas. Xerox's own researchers built the mouse-driven Windows and icon screen years before anyone else shipped anything close to it. And Xerox's leadership let it sit in a lab, while another company turned it into the operating system standard the entire industry still uses. This is one of the most cited stories in business history for a reason. It isn't really a story about technology. It's a story about what happens when a company's structure separates invention from commercialization so completely that brilliant work simply never reaches a customer. Let's start with what actually happened inside the building. In 1970, Xerox founded a research lab in Palo Alto, California, later known as Xerox PARC. The idea from the top was straightforward: fund serious, long-horizon research into the office of the future and let brilliant computer scientists chase ideas without the usual product cycle pressure. That freedom worked spectacularly. Throughout the 1970s, researchers at PARC built the first practical computer mouse as an everyday input device. They built the first graphical user interface with overlapping windows and clickable icons, the direct ancestor of every desktop you have ever used. They built Ethernet, the networking technology that still carries traffic inside offices today. They built the first laser printer. They were, by any reasonable measure, 10 years ahead of the rest of the computing industry. Here's the first surprising fact worth sitting with. None of this was secret or hidden from Xerox's own leadership. It wasn't a rogue skunkworks project nobody upstairs knew about. Executives saw demonstrations. They funded the lab for years. The technology existed, worked, and was visible internally, well before it existed anywhere else in the world. So why didn't Xerox turn it into the defining product of the decade? The honest answer is structural, not personal. Xerox's business was copiers. Copiers were an extraordinarily profitable, well-understood business, with entrenched sales channels, entrenched customer relationships, and entrenched ways of measuring success. A small computer with a mouse and windows didn't fit any existing product category, any existing sales pitch, or any existing revenue model that Xerox's core leadership actually managed day to day. PARC sat in Palo Alto. Corporate leadership sat far away, both geographically and organizationally. The researchers reported up through a research hierarchy that prized publishable, prestigious ideas. The people who decided what got built, priced, and sold reported up through a completely different hierarchy that prized copier margins and copier customers. Those two hierarchies barely intersected. This is worth naming directly, because it's the actual mechanism at work, not just an interesting historical detail. Research organizations, left on their own, will optimize for the values their own leadership rewards. If a research lab is rewarded for producing impressive demos and interesting papers, it will produce impressive demos and interesting papers. Nothing in that reward structure forces anyone to ask the much harder question: who owns turning this into a shipped, priced, supported product on a deadline with a profit and loss attached to it? At Xerox, apparently, no one clearly did. Look at the budgeting mechanics underneath that gap, because this is where most organizations quietly repeat the same mistake today. Funding a research lab is a single, predictable line item. It gets approved once a year, reviewed lightly, and left alone as long as the lab keeps producing interesting output. Funding a brand new product line is a completely different kind of decision. It means pulling engineers off proven, revenue-generating work. It means building sales training, support processes, and manufacturing or distribution from scratch. It means someone senior putting their own credibility behind a bet with no track record yet. Those two kinds of spending decisions get evaluated by different people, on different timelines, against different risk tolerances. A brilliant prototype can clear the first bar easily and still never clear the second one, not because anyone rejected it outright, but because no formal process ever forced the comparison. Now here's where the story gets its most famous scene, and its second surprising fact. In 1979, Xerox's venture capital arm was negotiating an investment in a small, fast-growing company called Apple Computer. As part of that arrangement, Xerox agreed to let Steve Jobs and a handful of Apple engineers tour PARC and see the research directly, in exchange for the opportunity to buy Apple stock before its public offering. On paper, this looked like a reasonable, mutually beneficial deal for a big, cash-rich company hedging its bets in a hot new industry. What happened next is the part every version of this story gets to eventually, and it holds up under scrutiny. Jobs reportedly walked through the demonstration and immediately grasped what Xerox's own executives had somehow not fully acted on for most of a decade, that a graphical, mouse-driven interface wasn't a research curiosity. It was the future shape of every computer normal people would ever use. Sit with the gap in that moment. A visitor, on a single afternoon tour, arriving with fresh eyes and a specific outside goal, saw more commercial potential in Xerox's own lab than the people who had funded, staffed, and overseen that lab for most of 10 years. That is not a story about Jobs being smarter than every Xerox executive combined. It's a story about proximity and incentive. Jobs was building a computer company. Recognizing this is how people will want to use a computer was directly, urgently relevant to the thing he was already trying to build and sell. For PARC's overseers, that same insight competed for attention against an already highly profitable copier business that didn't need saving. Apple moved fast from there. Engineers began incorporating graphical interface concepts into Apple's own product development. It took years of internal work, false starts, and design iteration, not an overnight copy-paste. But in 1984, Apple shipped the Macintosh with a graphical interface, complete with a mouse, windows, and icons, and marketed it directly at ordinary consumers and small businesses, not just research labs. The Macintosh didn't just adopt the concept, it popularized it at scale for people who had never touched a computer before. Here is the third surprising fact, and it's the one most retellings of this story skip entirely. Xerox did try to ship its own graphical computer. It wasn't purely asleep at the wheel. The company released the Xerox Star, a workstation built around the same underlying research aimed at business customers. The Star simply never found its market. It launched at a price point far above what most businesses were prepared to pay for a single workstation, with limited compatible software and with nowhere near the marketing push, sales training, or retail presence that Apple would later put behind the Macintosh. It was a real product, built on real working technology. It just never became more than a footnote, while a company that hadn't invented any of the underlying research became synonymous with the entire concept in the public imagination. That's the part worth sitting with, because it means this is not a simple story about a company that missed an opportunity through pure oversight. Xerox saw the opportunity clearly enough to build an actual shipping product around it. What it lacked wasn't vision at the product level. It was organizational follow-through, at scale, sustained over years, with pricing, marketing, and distribution all pulling in the same direction. Now for the mid-story pivot, the part that changes how you should actually think about this whole case. It would be easy to walk away thinking the lesson here is simply protect your best ideas better, or watch out for outside visitors. But here's the part nobody expects when they look closer at how these situations actually unfold inside real companies. The danger was never really about Apple. Even if Jobs had never toured PARC, this same basic gap between brilliant research division and unrelated core business would likely have produced a similar outcome eventually, just with a different name attached to the eventual winner. The core problem long predates the specific visit and would have outlived it. Business historians and organizational researchers have studied this exact pattern across many companies since, not only Xerox, and they generally converge on the same underlying diagnosis. When a research or innovation function is structurally, financially, and culturally isolated from the units responsible for building, pricing, and selling products, the isolation itself becomes the primary risk. Not any single individual's judgment, not any single missed meeting, the structure itself. It's worth comparing this to a closely related, equally well-known pattern researchers sometimes call the not invented here effect, where established teams undervalue or resist ideas that originate outside their own group, even when those ideas are objectively strong. Xerox's situation had a flavor of the opposite problem. The ideas were invented squarely inside the company, celebrated inside their own division, and still failed to cross the internal boundary into the part of the business that could scale them. The barrier wasn't rejection. It was simply the absence of any real bridge connecting the two sides at all. It's also worth comparing this to the broader phenomenon of structural inertia in large organizations, where a business becomes so optimized around its current, highly profitable core product that anything genuinely new, even something built by its own people, struggles to get organizational priority, headcount, and executive attention against an existing cash cow. Xerox's copier business wasn't in decline in the 1970s. It didn't need saving. That very success may have made it harder, not easier, to justify diverting serious resources toward an unfamiliar, unproven computing product line. This pattern is closely related to what management researchers later described as the innovator's dilemma, the observation that well-run, successful companies can lose entire new markets, not from laziness or incompetence, but because their existing customers, existing metrics, and existing profit margins all rationally point them away from an unproven new category, right up until it's too late to catch up. Xerox's case sits comfortably inside that broader pattern, with one added twist. The company didn't just fail to react to an outside threat quickly enough. It had already built the threat itself, inside its own walls, and still couldn't organize around it. Now imagine a completely different, more ordinary version of this same dynamic, one you don't need a famous 1970s research lab to recognize. Picture a mid-sized company with a small internal innovation team, maybe 3 or 4 people, tasked with exploring what's next outside the pressure of quarterly targets. Over a year, that team builds something genuinely useful, a tool, a workflow, a process improvement that could meaningfully help the company's actual customers or actual frontline staff. They demo it internally. Leadership nods, calls it promising, and moves on to the next quarterly review. No one owns turning it into something shipped. No budget line exists for it. No sales team has ever heard of it. A year later, a competitor, or sometimes just a different internal team with better access to resources, builds something similar and actually launches it. The original team's work becomes an internal case study in what we should have done, rather than a product anyone outside the building ever uses. Or picture it in a completely different setting. A regional retail chain whose in-store staff, the people actually talking to customers every day, keep noticing the same recurring complaint and quietly build a workaround for it, maybe a better way to handle returns or a simple scheduling fix that cuts customer wait times noticeably. Regional managers know about it. It works. It just never gets formally proposed upward because there's no clear channel for a store-level improvement to become a company-wide policy, and no one at headquarters is explicitly tasked with scouting for exactly this kind of frontline innovation. Meanwhile, headquarters keeps funding its official Customer Experience Initiative, staffed by people several layers removed from an actual store floor, chasing a version of the same problem from scratch. That scenario plays out constantly, in companies of every size, in industries that have nothing to do with computers or copiers. The names change. The underlying structural failure doesn't. Here's my own take on why this particular failure mode is so persistent, and it's worth saying plainly. Most companies are extremely good at rewarding the people who protect and optimize an existing, profitable business, and comparatively bad at rewarding anyone for creating uncertainty around it, even productive uncertainty. A researcher who builds something brilliant but unproven is, by definition, creating ambiguity about resources, priorities, and existing product lines. Unless someone with real authority is explicitly rewarded for resolving that ambiguity in favor of shipping the new thing, the safer, more rational individual choice for almost everyone involved is to let it stay a fascinating internal demo. So what does a manager actually do with this, beyond simply admiring or lamenting the Xerox story? Start with a specific, uncomfortable question about your own team or organization. If a genuinely valuable idea emerged from a research group, a skunkworks project, or even just one unusually creative employee tomorrow, Who, specifically, by name and by role, owns the decision to turn it into a shipped, funded, prioritized product? Not leadership as an abstract collective noun. A specific person with real authority over budget and roadmap, whose job explicitly includes evaluating and advancing ideas that originate outside the normal planning cycle. If you can't name that person immediately, you already have a structural gap similar to the one that sat inside Xerox for most of a decade. It may never produce a headline-grabbing failure on the scale of the graphical interface story, but smaller versions of the exact same gap are quietly costing most organizations real value every single year in ideas that never make it past an internal demo. A second, related practical step: build a real, scheduled bridge between whatever exploratory or research-adjacent work happens in your organization and the people who actually control shipping decisions. Not a once-a-year innovation showcase that ends in applause and nothing else. A recurring, structured review where promising work is explicitly evaluated against a real question: does this get funded and staffed for actual production, or does it get killed on purpose with a clear reason? Both outcomes are fine. What's not fine is the third, most common outcome. Nothing gets decided at all, and the idea simply fades from memory. A third step, maybe the least comfortable one: audit whether your own incentive structure rewards people for protecting the existing, profitable core of the business more than it rewards them for successfully shipping something genuinely new and initially uncertain. If your best people are implicitly, even unintentionally, punished for spending time on unproven ideas instead of optimizing this quarter's known numbers, you shouldn't be surprised when your organization's best ideas quietly stall exactly the way Xerox's did. None of this requires a research lab, a famous visitor, or a defining moment in computing history to matter. It requires recognizing that invention and commercialization are two entirely different organizational muscles, and that a company can be world-class at one while being almost completely disconnected from the other. Xerox PARC produced some of the most important computing breakthroughs of the 20th century. The company that owned that lab captured only a small fraction of the value those breakthroughs eventually created for the world. That gap wasn't inevitable. It wasn't caused by a lack of talent, a lack of vision at the product level, or even, really, by one afternoon tour in 1979. It was caused by an organization that never built a real, sustained pathway connecting its best new ideas to the part of the business capable of turning them into something people could actually buy. The practical takeaway for any manager, at any company, isn't protect your ideas from competitors, it's build the internal pathway before you need it. Identify, right now, who owns moving a promising idea from demo to shipped product in your organization. If the honest answer is no one, really, fix that this quarter, before someone else's afternoon tour turns your research into their product. Hit follow if you've seen this happen at work.